Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience, a different concept than the regular show today. We're going to get you prepared to play DraftKings golf in the 2018 season. Everything from where you should do your research, the types of tournaments you should select, what stats you should look at. Does course history matter? How much should you factor in the weather? These are all the topics we're going to cover today. It's going to be a round table of me, who writes a lot and plays a little bit, but two guys that dominate at DraftKings Golf. They're going to share some of the secrets along with you. It's Jeff Bergerson from FantasyGolfInsider.com and Ben Rasa from FanVice.com. Ben, what's going on, dude?
Not much. Just, excited to be talking some golf before the holiday season, because right after it, the season starts, and once it starts, it doesn't end for a long time. So, ready to go.
Yeah, January all the way through the Tour Championship, then you get a 2-week break, then you got 6 more tournaments to go. Jeff, are you excited to go from football back to golf?
I am. I totally am. The PGA and golf is so great because there aren't too many weeks off during the year. And those weeks that are off, we have football, which is good. But I am really happy for the PGA to be back, not just European Tour events, but PGA Tour events with all the big-time players. So I'm excited.
Okay, so what we're going to do first is I'm going to let you know where I start my process every single week. I always go to FantasyNational.com. I find it a one-stop shop for anyone that really wants to dig in and do their research. Rolling stats. It has tournament history, the length of the holes on the course. It's just a great stop. Another place that I like to go to is PGA Tour HQ. You don't need to be a media member. If you just Google PGA Tour Media, you can get yourself a login, and you can go back and read some of the interviews and reports from last year. Read a round-by-round recap. I feel like that really gives you a sense of where people were, because sometimes you look on the Sunday final leaderboard and you see a guy who came like T22, but it turns out he was 1 stroke off the lead after the 3rd round. Like, what happened? Why did that guy collapse? And maybe you need to put him back on your radar this season. He had 1 bad round. Did that kill him? So I like to gather as much info as possible, but I find I can do that always at FantasyNational.com. So go check it out there. Go test out the site and see what it offers. But I know that it's a place where we're not giving out picks at FantasyNational.com. It's a place for you to make your own picks and do your own research and build your own lineups with the custom generator and the custom model and the ownership projections. But I know, Jeff, at FantasyGolfInsider.com, you guys have a lot of helpful tools as well. Plus, we get your core players every week.
Yeah, so we have articles talking about cash game specifics, GPP article that I do every week. Plus, we have the tools. We have the tournament history. We have a tool that compares the sportsbook odds versus the pricing of every player in the field. We have rolling stats. We have an ownership predictor. We have a lineup generator that produces hundreds of lineups with the click of your mouse. So we use all of those things, and I use every single tool that we have on our site in my research every week.
Plus, you also have Euro Golf in there, too.
We do have Euro Golf, and it's really great when there's big-time players over on the Euro side as well. We have actually 2 Euro-specific columns every week. Perry writes one, and I write my GPP picks in that as well. So we're giving out how we use the tools in our articles, along with who we're actually selecting week in and week out in all these contests.
And you can find all of that at FantasyGolfInsider.com. Ben, tell us a little bit about what FanVice.com is offering for the 2018 season.
Yeah, so, obviously I write an article every week. We have podcasts with me, Andrew Barron, and Tim Frank. And really where I truly start my research every week is with Tim's form guides. I'm sure a ton of people who are listening will know them. Fantasy Golf Man's form guides kind of gives you a crash course between, the course history, how guys are playing, some of the odds. And it's just a great way to get off the ground each week. So between that, we're doing projections this year, which I'm really excited about. And then we have, honestly, one of my favorite things about FanVice is the Slack channel. If you're a member, you can go in there, talk with a lot of other people, and people really do drop a lot of useful information, especially late at night, if there's a weather thing, if a guy is withdrawing, things like that. So it's kind of just a really good spot for little tidbits that you can pick up along the way, as opposed to the, the articles and the podcasts where you're going to get the crutch of your information.
All right, so let's get into it. We talked a little bit briefly about starting your research. We all pick the places that we like to start at, but what is it specifically, Ben, that you look at first? You mentioned Tim Frank's spreadsheets, but like, what are the stats you're looking at first? What are you trying to get to pop out to you? Because although a lot of people kind of debate the merits of course history, it is something that I do like to look at, if not only to see what players have played well, but what types of players have excelled at this course in the past.
Yeah, I think that's the distinction to make. A lot of people, they pull up the course history and they see the results and then they think, oh, this guy is really good. What I try to do, I try to pull up, the history of the course and then get a type of golfer that should do well there. Not necessarily the guys who have finished well, just the type of player. So you try to get a feel for the course, see who that could correlate to, and then, I mix and match that with, the current form, who's playing well, who's trending upward, and try to see if anyone kind of crosses over both lists.
Jeff, where do you start your research every week?
So it sounds kind of corny, but I actually have a physical notebook that I take detailed notes on for every single tournament right after the fact, after it wraps up. I'm taking notes, and I have it for the last 4 years on ownership trends, what happened, who was on who played well, what the weather conditions were. I just take detailed notes on everything that happened so I can always reference that. And that's where I really start. I look at the years past at the same tournament, and it gives me an insight as to what happened, because you can't remember every little detail. And you can look at course history, but there's still things that you miss by not having detailed notes. So I start there. And then I look at the player field the Friday previous to the event. The field's released at 5 o'clock on PGAtour.com. I always check that out to see make sure who's in the field this year, because sometimes that changes from year to year. And that's really where I start and get a good baseline as to what I'm looking for in the coming week's event.
Yeah, so what I really like to try to do off the top, and a lot of this has to do with that I'm creating a lot of content, and my specialty is more creating the content and doing a lot of the research to provide the information for people to make their own selections. They can follow me if they want, but you guys are putting in some serious coin every single week. So I think the approach that I take is more from a content perspective and you kind of hit on it. Like, I want to know how many players are in the field. Is it going to be a 156-man field? Is it going to be 132? Is it 118? Is it one of these invitational tournaments that could have 110? Just because when I'm thinking about DraftKings is that I want to get 6 of 6 guys through the cut. You're probably not going to win anything if you don't have 6 of 6. But if it's a 156-man field versus a 110-man field, just the odds of getting all your players through the cut drastically increase. So just that bare bones information. Where is it? What's the grass type? And I find that futureoffantasy.com, Josh Culp's site, is a very big help with this. You can even just go back and see player interviews about the course, what they saw in certain years. It has all that basic info, and I try to provide some of that myself when you check out all of my columns up on dkplaybook.com. That's really what I'm trying to attack: a course outline, a field outline, what you're going to need to do this week, and the stats to look at. But like I mentioned before, if you Google PGA Tour Media and just click on the first link that comes up, you can sign up for the HQ site. And like I said, I like to go back, sort by year, go back to the previous year, maybe even the previous 2 years, and just read the round by round report. And Jeff, you kind of hit on this. Was the weather wonky that year? Is that why the scores turned out like they were? How is the course playing? Did certain guys kind of pop up and then go away? Do you ever use that site at all?
I have used it, yes, absolutely.
Ben, is that a part of your process at all?
Definitely. After I kind of get the macro approach to it, that's one of the things that I definitely dig in with, because, Jeff brought up a good point. When you look at course history, you're getting kind of just the results. There's a lot of variables that go into that, and sometimes there's a total outlier, whether it's weather or just a bizarre situation. And I think the media site sometimes can help you pick up on those things.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff is taking frivolous notes all the way through the weekend. I actually have a sort of a file on my computer as well that I try to reference every year, be like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. I wouldn't have picked that up if I hadn't written it down. But I do find that the recaps on the PGA Tour Media website really do help me get more of a grasp on what happened, especially the round by round. Like, you can click round 1 report, round 2 report, even to see things like in DraftKings scoring, you can get the bogey-free bonuses, and it will show you, like, hey, here are the guys that played bogey-free rounds last year. Is it going to happen a lot? Is it not going to happen a lot? And then I jump over to FantasyNational.com and start really digging into my stats. I can go back there, look at their course history. I can sort by the key stats from each year, no matter which one I want, and say, hey, in 2016, did this guy do well at this course because, hey, he gained 12 strokes putting on the field? That's unheard of. Is that why he won? Or was he awesome tee to green? And that way I can kind of filter out who I like, and then using the rolling stats, I can figure out who is doing well in those numbers already this season coming into the event. So that's how I really like to do it. So, Ben, what stats do you really I know it differs from course to course, but on the whole, what stats do you think are the most important?
For me, I mean, it's tee to green, usually approach. Guys that are striking the ball well, because putting is just, obviously, putting's always correlated to success. The problem is it's almost impossible to really chart who's going to putt well in a given week. Obviously, there's better putters than other guys. Certain grass types do help, but there's just so much variance. So what I like to find, if I know a guy is really striking the ball well, tee to green, he's driving it well, approaches are there, I'll take my chances and, hope that he hits a ton of greens and gives himself plenty of birdie chances, and I'll live with if he's ice with the putter. So that's kind of where I always focus. I think it's easier to project that than putting.
Well, this is how a lot of DraftKings players always end up on people like Luke List, even Keegan Bradley, and different players like that, because statistically, Lucas Glover is another one. They rate out really well in the tee to green and ball striking stats, but everyone always says, hey, their putting is going to flip because putting is high variance, but it never flips, and then they never win. So it becomes a bit of a problem. Jeff, what's your take on putting? Is it something to factor in just a little bit? Is it something to ignore, or do you overweight putting?
It depends on the course completely. I mean, if we have slower greens, less slope, then I'm going to give the edge to the ball strikers, because I generally go with strokes gained tee to green as my key stat every week as the overriding majority. But, as we get onto slicker greens, more slope, things like that, then those guys tend to struggle quite a bit more. So I completely just go off of what type of greens they're playing on, what course. And you'll see some guys do well on easy putting greens who are really poor putters. And in the case, like you mentioned, Lucas Glover, he's always been lights out tee to green. Webb Simpson's another guy, although his putting has come around considerably the last 6 months. But you'll see Lucas Glover play on these easier greens. And if he's middle of the pack in putting, that makes him a very valuable player all of a sudden, because he's normally okay, usually pays off his price when he's finishing 197th in putting for the week. So if they just putt average, then that gives them a big bump on the week.
Basically, to break this down for people who don't quite understand all the PGA stats, is that tee to green is factored into 3 separate areas: strokes gained off the tee, strokes gained approach, strokes gained around the green, and then they're factored into one overarching stat called strokes gained tee to green. Then there's strokes gained putting. Obviously, that's what you do on the greens. That's weighted against the field and the number of people that make a percentage of putts from a certain spot. Now, one of the reasons that people prefer tee to green is that it's repeatable. So generally, if someone is good tee to green, they consistently tend to be good tee to green every week. The way I always like to describe it is Dustin Johnson will go out every time and hit the ball 330 yards every single week. That's not going to change unless he's hurt. Now, he could be the best player in the field putting, or he could be the worst player in the field putting, but there's no way that Matt Kuchar is going to step on a tee ever and drive the ball 330 yards consistently. He's going to drive it around 300. Ben, is that why we prefer tee to green? Because it is consistent. It is projectable, whereas things like putting and chipping are not.
Exactly. I mean, you just talked about it. There will be weeks where someone like Dustin Johnson, who's not a great putter, will have a lights-out putting week. There'll also be where he's ice cold. But his driving, for the most part, is going to stay the same, especially, like you said. He's going to crush the ball. He always does. But the putting can come and go. Obviously, there's guys, there's exceptions. You have Ricky, some elite putters who, they're going to beat the field more often than not. And then you have guys on the other side like Luke List, who he just never putts well, it seems like. But for the most part, those guys in the middle of the pack, if they putt well, they're going to succeed. But the tee to green is a little more quantifiable.
Jeff, we've developed two different strokes gained metrics at Fantasy National. Instead of breaking it up to tee to green, we've actually just combined strokes gained off the tee and strokes gained approach and called that strokes gained ball striking. And then instead of having putting and chipping being two separate things, we've combined that into strokes gained around the green. Or not strokes gained around the green, strokes gained short game. Sorry, when you take around the green and putting it to one. Do you think that's a better way to try to develop some consistency with finding out who's good in certain things? Because I do think that short game does lend itself to, hey, maybe a guy's not a great putter, someone like Webb Simpson, but he has an amazing short game, and it really saves him in a lot of circumstances.
So are you just saying it's strokes gained tee to green minus around the green, basically?
Yeah, so just instead of adding strokes gained around the green into that, just use off the tee and approaches.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I don't know. I don't know, Pat.
Well, I always find that the scores that we want, and Ben, maybe you can weigh on this too, is that we talk about these are the consistent things, but even things like short game, I feel, can vary a lot from course to course just because around the green at every course isn't exactly the same. Like, take like the 2014 U.S. Open, for example. Like, Martin Keimer, historically, has one of the worst short games on tour. Now, that didn't matter at Pinehurst because he just hit the ball down the middle every single time and put it on every green. Short game never factored in, and that's why he was able to run away with the field. I feel like for DraftKings scoring, that off the tee and approach are going to be better predictors of DraftKings scoring, whereas around the green and putting, if you put some weight onto that, that's maybe going to help you figure out who's going to finish better, but not actually make the birdies that we're looking for, which is one of the big things between DraftKings scoring and actual results-based golf.
Yeah, that's a good point. So at FanVice, we were doing a lot of that with weekend golf, because there it's more, you just need the pure scoring. Whereas, on the week, you need guys who are getting through the cut. And scrambling, things like that, that's more geared toward actual golf and where you're finishing. Because, guys getting up and down for par and things, they're not great scorers, but they're saving placement points. So I don't mind that at all. I mean, you talked about it. There are some guys who they may be terrible chippers, but if they can make 10-footers, 15-footers, it doesn't really matter. They're going in with par, rather than someone who chips it to 1 foot and taps in. It's the same result. So, yeah, no problem with that. I think it's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, that's why I like to separate those two things. Jeff, can you talk a little bit about how, sort of to that point, how DraftKings scoring doesn't always correlate with finishing position and the sorts of players that you should be targeting?
Oh, certainly. So Ben mentioned weekend golf. That's the perfect example because finishing points don't factor in. It's just all about scoring. And you really don't care how volatile a player's game might be. So, for example, if a guy, throws up a bunch of birdies and eagles, but then bogeys all over the place, you'd rather have that. Whereas if you're talking about finishing position, you obviously want to avoid that. So a guy like you talk about like a Jim Furyk or a Matt Kuchar who are more consistent. They aren't going to have their blow up holes. Are not as valuable on DraftKings for point scoring wise as a guy who is much more volatile, like a Daniel Berger or a Brooks Koepka or a Tony Finau type, who have the opportunity to eagle, put up the big points, multiple birdies, but also have the ability to blow up on some holes as well. So you definitely want to factor in the scoring and target those types of players.
Well, and even to kind of hop on the weekend golf thing a little bit, when I'm always trying to get my 6-6 guys through the cut in terms of the 4-round DraftKings golf because you need those 6 guys. However, when it comes to weekend golf, the big thing where I've had success doing it so far, and it's really tough to track, you almost have to go to the PGA Tour app or the PGA.com website and look at the strokes gained putting numbers from people. It's not to say that if someone's gained 4.5 strokes putting through 2 rounds that they're not going to keep that up. They definitely could. But if you see a guy who's super inflated high versus a guy who's super inflated low, but he's striking the ball so well, those are the guys to target in weekend golf, right, Jeff?
Yes, I agree with that, Pat. And that's why, we look at the stats for the first 2 rounds oftentimes heading into the weekend to see who is dominated in what area. And putting, we might discount a player and their chances over the weekend if putting's the only thing that they've done really well over the first 2 days.
Ben, would you agree?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I can just off the top of my head, I'm remembering a week where Sebastian Munoz, he had gained like 10 strokes putting through 36 holes and he was winning. And you look at the stats, he really wasn't striking the ball great. He was just putting the lights out. It's hard to have that happen, through the 4 days. So a guy who's maybe crushing at tee to green, but he hasn't made anything is a more valuable target on weekend golf just because you think maybe his putting is due to regress and he can get hot with the putter.
And it goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning in terms of tee to green and ball striking being more consistent round to round to round, whereas putting can flip up and down. So if someone has lost 2.5 strokes putting through those rounds, that could just go back to average. And if it goes back to average, that means they're actually going to be a little bit better than the field over the course of the final 2 rounds, while their ball striking stays exactly the same. So if you have someone who's lost 2 strokes putting, yet they still make the cut, they're probably striking the ball pretty well to begin with. I think the biggest example of that I can remember was actually at the Players' Championship. That was the week that I won. I mean, that was a really tough week for people to figure out going into it, but once we had the weekend numbers, like Siwoo Kim won me all the weekend golf DraftKings money because he had lost 3 strokes putting to the field, and he was 3 under going into the weekend. He was leading the field tee to green, and no one really seemed to notice. That's right when weekend golf was first started coming into the scene, and no one knew what to look for. Now that we know where to look for, do you think there's still a massive advantage, Ben, in terms of weekend golf?
Yeah, definitely. That's something, at FanVice we're really trying to hit this year because I think there's still an edge, particularly with one thing that you got to look for is how the tee times are going. Sometimes, especially if there's been a weather delay, they'll do split tee times, and that's kind of like a U shape where the leaders and also the guys who almost missed the cut tee off last. They're just on separate 9s. But if it's more traditional, then you have guys going out really early, and the leaders don't even tee off to some of those guys are done. So you can kind of correlate your teams based on getting out early and the weather on the weekend, still for a big edge. And a lot of people don't look to see what type of format the tournament is using.
Jeff, would you kind of pile onto that in terms of weekend golf where, do you think it's better to target guys in either the middle of the pack or try to stack a tee time in weekend golf just like you would in regular 4-round golf?
When you're talking about weekend GPPs, oftentimes people are naturally gravitating toward people at the top of the leaderboard, which doesn't make any sense because it doesn't necessarily dictate where they're going to finish. And since there are no finishing points, it's just all based on scoring. There is no correlation between the two. So I try and kind of do my best to fade those guys if I don't like their prospects over the weekend as much because I know the ownership will be toward those guys near the top.
Switching back to the regular 4-round golf, I want to kind of hit back on players that are better on DraftKings. Not specific players, but stats to target to make you say, hey, this guy finishes T36 every single week, but in DraftKings scoring, he finishes 9th every single week. Why is that? And one of the things this breaks back down to in doing your research right off the top is go look at the number of birdies that were made at, let's say, the last 3 years at this course, if that information is available, if it's a course that players have played at before. If it's a new course, obviously, that's very difficult to project. Is it a course that's a par 72, meaning it has 4 par 5s on it? That means that the potential for eagles is always so much higher, but you can even go look at that. I mean, sometimes par 5s are not accessible in 2 shots, even to the longest players in the field. It's that sort of research that can really give you an edge, and we talked about players like Tony Finau and Luke List and Lucas Glover and even Xander Schauffele for a while, that when you know that there are eagles to be made, Ben, do you gravitate more towards that type of player on a par 72 where it would be against like a par 71 or a par 70?
Definitely. I mean, if you're looking at a course where you know there's going to be major scoring, eagles are going to be, had, that the placement points aren't going to correlate as well to where people finish in terms of DraftKings points. If it's a really tough course, there's not going to be a ton of streaks. There's not going to be a ton of bonuses. So you can kind of more rely on where do you think guys are going to finish. Grinding out a solid round is fine. But if it's a very easy course, if it's a par 72, the par 5s are very accessible. That's something where I'm going to look to birdie or better percentage and just that upside that you need. Because not only do you need your guys to play well in real life, you need them to score well.
So from a statistical standpoint, Jeff, on an easier course, let's say we're dealing with a par 72, we're dealing with the Canadian Open, it's Glen Abbey, and guys are going to have the potential to make eagle on 3 of the 4 par 5s. Are there certain stats you then would gravitate towards, something like eagle rate, birdie or better percentages on par 5s, that sort of thing?
Yes, absolutely, no question. And like you had touched upon, it goes into the next level of research. Like, how long are these par fives? If there's 600 and some yards, then it's going to equal it out a little bit. But if they're reachable, then that totally makes a difference for the longer hitters. So then I throw in driving distance, birdie or better on par fives, eagles not so much, but it kind of goes hand in hand with the longer hitters and the birdie or better percentage. So yes, looking for the scores on scoreable courses.
So I know there's no definitive number in winning score that you can really point to look at, hey, this is one where I want to target, high variance scoring guys that are going to make birdies, guys that are going to make bogeys. I know that's always kind of what you want, but let's say we have a course that is exceptionally difficult, like something like the U.S. Open. And I know that the 2017 U.S. Open didn't really follow that, but most U.S. Opens are incredibly difficult to score at. There's just not a lot of birdies to go around. Now, with that, Jeff, have you going back to the Matt Kuchar, Jim Furyk, Bill Haas type player who that could just get you the finishing points that you need?
Absolutely. Yep, I totally agree with that. And I thought that's what we were going to get at Erin Hills last year. It didn't turn out that way. But definitely more plotters, guys who are going to not blow up on holes because of horribly thick rough, which we had at Erin Hills. It just no one hit it into it because the fairways were so wide. But really fast greens where there aren't a lot of birdies to be had. Definitely we want more plotters than scorers on those type of courses.
Ben, do you take a similar approach when you look back at different tournaments and see what the previous winning scores were and then adjust your strategy around that? Or even see things like with Erin Hills, and Jeff kind of mentioned, I overlooked it. I think a lot of people overlooked it, is that those fairways were so big, no one was going to miss them. And it's like when they play at Kapalua. When you play at Kapalua, the fairways are so wide, people don't miss them, ever. People are going to hit the fairway like 90% of the time. On FantasyNational.com, we use a stat called strokes gained fairway, which actually compare, instead of just using the driving accuracy metric, which takes in consideration, not how thin or wide fairways are, the strokes gained, fairways gained metric actually factors in how difficult the field is at hitting the fairways in that week and weights it against each other. Do you think that's another element to look at each and every week?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you have the course history, you can kind of gauge it pending there wasn't any crazy weather or anything. And I definitely, I'll weigh more sand saves, just guys who can grind. You don't have to worry about streaks at a course where the cut is going to be, deep into the pluses and the winning score might be only a couple under par. One thing I do want to touch upon, though, if we have no course history, this is where I had a lot of success last year, just making correlated teams. So, I would try to project how a course would work, but if I truly didn't know, I would make a couple lineups, that are more guys who can grind, safe plotter guys. And then I'd make a couple lineups that are more upside guys, a little high volatility, because maybe the course plays easier than people are going to project, like Erin Hills is a perfect example.
All right, well, Jeff, let me hit you with that, too. In terms of lineup construction, besides, let's talk from a tournament perspective, a GPP perspective. You're trying to win the big money here against a whole bunch of people. How do you go about picking your lineups? Because I think what Ben just said is very interesting, is correlate stats. A lot of people correlate tee times. Hey, I hear the weather's going to be bad in the afternoon. Let me use 6 morning players, and maybe that turns out to be the easy side. I love doing that, but I always do the anti-stack as well in case, hey, it's weather. We're not the best at predicting weather. No one is. So maybe we have it completely wrong, but I'll have my influence on one side go very heavy, but it's not like I'm not going to play 5 to 10% of my teams on the other side either, just in case that turns out to be the big key. I know Drew Dinkmeyer had a lot of success doing that last year, like in back-to-back weeks when everyone was just wrong with the weather. But on an average week for tournament play, in terms of number of lineups, in terms of core players, how do you really construct your lineup?
So, there's a lot of different levels to winning consistently in GPPs. And when I say consistently, it doesn't happen very often when you actually take down these big GPPs. But to cash and stay in the game, there's weather, most definitely. But when there's not weather involved, I'm looking a lot at ownership, because it's very important. Golf is a very high variance sport as opposed to football. There's variance in football, but with golf, basically anything can happen. The best in the world can miss the cut and get you a 0 over the weekend. So if we identify based on just listening to people in the industry, who they're recommending, ownership trends over previous weeks, which we look closely at, we can kind of predict who's going to be owned heavily. And if a guy is going to be owned by 35+% going into a week, we definitely need to strongly consider fading that player, because anything can happen. It might look like a strong play all over the place. I may like a guy going into a week, but if I see he's going to be owned by 40-45%, I'm more apt to get on the fade train for that and separate myself from half the field if something crazy does happen.
I always feel like the best advice I was given about GPPs, and to kind of piggyback on that point, is don't be afraid to lose. Some weeks most weeks, you're not going to win. Almost never are you going to win a giant tournament and win $100,000 and that sort of thing. But if you fade the highest owned player, at least the highest projected owned player, generally speaking, if that guy doesn't win or come inside the top 3, you're way ahead of the game. How do you treat ownership, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's no magic answer. It definitely falls in between. If a guy's 40% owned, I don't just obviously blindly fade him, because sometimes, I love the spot and I actually want to be overweight. But, you got to gauge where it is. And you also have to gauge where his price is. So if a guy is egregiously mispriced and he's, say, only 6,500 on DraftKings, he has a lot of room to get there. It's not like he needs to win. If he makes the cut, he's probably going to, return a pretty good value. Now, if one of the top guys, is going to be very popular, to me, that's a more juicy fade, just because he's priced in where he's going to need a top 5, sometimes a top 3. If it's a weird tournament, he actually probably has to win to really get there. And that just gives, it's hard to do that. It's really hard to win a golf tournament. So if I know a guy's going to be 35-40% owned and he needs a top 3, if I don't project his chances of doing that as good as his ownership, I'll look to be underweight.
Well, you can look at it in 2 ways, I think. If it's a very high-owned player that is an elite player, and there's other elite players in the field who are just going under-owned, then I think that makes a lot of sense. Like, from a skill perspective, that, like, let's take the Waste Management Open, for example. Hideki and Ricky do well there every single season. And those 2 guys are going to be the 2 highest-owned guys. But let's say there's another player who's in there. So you can project one out at 30%, one at 28%. Jeff, what would be the merits of switching off those 2 guys and going with the 5% owned, let's say Brooks Koepka, for example, someone on that skill level, but no one's going to be owned. Whereas if there's like a $6,700 player that's going to be like 25% owned, unless he's egregiously mispriced, he just happens to be the buzz guy that week that people are going to do well, that you can pivot off to him onto someone else, and they're right around the same skill level as well. Is there a preference that you have there?
Well, definitely the lower price, generally the lower floor that these guys have, and the higher chance that they that a lot of people miss badly on it. So if a guy is at 6,700, and that happened many times last year on DraftKings, where a guy was really badly mispriced, down below in that range, but there's still a reason that guy is down in that lower range, because he's not a Brooks Koepka or a Ricky Fowler, and his downside is a lot greater than a Brooks Koepka or Ricky Fowler up top. So fading those guys makes a lot of sense if we know that they're going to be heavily owned. Now, a higher price guy makes it a little bit more difficult, because what's the downside for one of those high price guys? Not as low, but it's still they could miss the cut. It just doesn't happen as often. So, but I think, Pat, to address something that you said, that's exactly what I say to a lot of our members when you talk about not being afraid to lose. And you see that. I was just at the Football Live final in Miami, and you see some of the best DFS players in the world. And you see some of their lineups that they turn into this tournament that is a $12 million prize pool. I mean, life-changing money, right? These guys are not afraid to take chances, right? They're making bold stacks, bold game stacks, and you need to determine what type of player you are. And if you can't make plays that you can't look outside the box and make these aggressive plays, which GPPs you need to do, then you should play in GPPs. So you need to define what kind of player you're going to be, and if you can't see things a certain way, then you probably don't play GPPs. Probably stick to cash games, make more basic moves where ownership doesn't matter. If a guy's owned by 60%, doesn't matter, you're still on him. But GPPs, you have to be willing to make very bold moves and take a 0 on any given week.
So what do you think this is tough because this all depends on bankroll and your bankroll management. Obviously, players with more money can play more lineups in the more expensive tournaments, and that's always the best way to really, the more people that you can factor out of a tournament in a GPP, the better chance you have of winning straight off the top. When you play in the $4 20 max entry one, you're dealing with a lot of people. It's going to be very difficult to win that. Not to say that I don't play my 20 entries in the $4 every week. I do, and I know that most people do. So, Ben, how do you go about? Let's use 20 as a barometer if you're playing multiple lineups. And I know some people play 150 in the bigger ones. I know you play a bunch of lineups in a variety of different tournaments. So let's talk about 20 lineups. What do you think the best way to approach 20 lineups is?
So, again, I do try to take it week to week. I get that question all the time at FanVice is like, what's the perfect amount to use a guy, or like how many people should I have in my pool? I do think it depends week to week. But generally what I do when I do make 20 lineups, because I do build by hand, if I want to keep it pretty tight, I actually make 15 lineups, and then I 2v2 the last 5. So it makes my core really solid. I'll build as if I only have 15, make them, and then I'll just pick 5 lineups, and I'll switch 2 guys on each of them. So I kind of get that same blend. It pumps up the main guys that I'm on, but it gives me a couple different outs. So if that core hits, I have a lot of different permutations on the back end because, if you spread yourself too thin, you're just going to end up raking yourself. You won't get crushed, but you'll just slowly bleed the money. And you guys both touched upon that. That's not the way to do it. You would much rather gutter ball a week and then hit a week for, the full thing, and you'll make up plenty of ground. It'll sustain you for the whole year. So that's how I approach it. I usually make a handful of lineups, and then I'll slowly tweak them to give myself some different combinations.
Al Smiz kind of explained this to me during football season a few years ago, and basically he said you win a GPP, a big GPP, it pays for approximately like 5 years worth of entries. So if you're not having the Ricky Bobby, if you're not first year last approach, you're probably playing giant tournaments wrong. Jeff, how do you approach making 20 lineups?
I think Ben hit it right on the nose in that you're building a core, and whether you're making 20 lineups or 150 lineups, the size of your core would just change a little bit, and the amount of peripheral guys that you add to it. But I think the process is still the same no matter how many lineups you're making. You build the core. If it's 20 lineups, you're making a much tighter core, but you have several opportunities if your core hits. You see a lot of people just owning everybody, and it just doesn't work. I mean, they might hit it every once in a while, but not as often as when you have a core and you have many different chances to hit on certain guys.
Well, I think that really speaks to like when people go to the top of DraftKings leaderboards and they see the same name with like 10 lineups inside the top 50, something like that. That is why you do build around the core players, because if your 4 core players really do hit, then the peripheral pieces around them are really the decider. So when you talk about core players, Jeff, what sort of percentage do you put on them? And let's talk about this from a 20 lineup perspective. Like, do you play, if you have 4 core players, do you play that lineup or mix them around on like 65%, 45%? Are you a 100% guy? Like, what is your personal weighting? And I know that changes for every single person, and it should. Like, I'm not someone who would play 100% of someone ever.
It depends on a couple of things. One is what you perceive the ownership to be from others in that same contest. So if you feel that a guy is going to be owned by 5%, if you want to be overweight, you can be significantly overweight by owning just 15 or 20% of him. You don't have to own 50 or 60%. But in a week where you think a guy who you're high on is going to be owned at 50%, and you want to be overweight on them, then you have to be at 70 or 80%. I don't have a problem with going 100% on a guy in a given week. I'm a very aggressive GPP player, but I can see a lot of other players in the industry are comfortable in that 50 to 70% range, just on average. But that's why it's so important to look at ownership projections and see what guys are going to be at in a given week, and to make sure that you are overweight. Because if you think, you own a guy at 30% and you think, oh yeah, I'm really high on this guy, but that's his ownership in the contest, then you're not overweight on him and you're not getting anywhere with it.
Ben, how do you go about constructing your core players? Like, do you kind of break everything down into pricing tiers and be like, oh, I need 2 big guys, I need 2 guys from this middle tier, I need 2 low guys to build around? And do core players, generally speaking, end up being not necessarily more elite players, but the more high-price players to middle-tier players, and then spread around more ownership towards the lower-end players, because obviously the higher variance comes in with the worst players?
Yeah, definitely to an extent. I don't know if this is unique, but I consistently try to get guys through the cut. I think a lot of people go more towards scoring and volatility, but I really do think that I can beat the 6 of 6 percentage on a given week. So I try to get guys that I'm confident are going to get through, whether they're, the elite guys, obviously, they get through more often than not. And then I mix and match, some guys that are more high upside, volatile scoring, guys you can hit lightning in the bottle with. And Jeff really hit the nail on the head. It's not about how much you own them. It's about the difference between yourself and the field. You don't know how many times, I've done it myself where I'm really high on a guy, I have him at 40%. And then he's 42% in the tournament, and it's, a wash. It doesn't help me at all. So you want to make sure that you're gauging properly on both sides. If a guy's only going to be 2%, you don't need 70% of them. You can get by with 20%, and if he goes nuts, you're going to be in a great spot, but you're not dead if he misses.
Can you explain why being overweight or underweight based on ownership percentages is important, though? I know you can kind of factor it through, but like logically speaking, mathematic-wise, let's say, why does that make a lot of sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's just important. So if you obviously, in simplest terms, if a guy is 10% owned by the field, only 1 out of every 10 lineups have him. But if 25% of your lineups have him, and that's the guy who wins, you're going to be playing against a small pool of other guys. I mean, as the tournament breaks down, once the cut washes away, you're kind of playing a tournament within a tournament. So if you're way overweight on some of the top guys, you're going to have permutations that are really limited within that tournament. And if you have a couple variations, you're going to be in really good shape to kind of make a big hit that week.
Jeff, when you build your core, do you do it by pricing tiers, or do you just say, hey, here are the 5 guys I like, here are the 6 guys I like, I'm going to build the majority of my lineups around them, and then add the periphery guys in after?
I generally build my core looking at price, yes, definitely. And then using our lineup generator, you obviously can't own just the high-priced guys, so you're going to have to mix in lower-priced guys. Generally speaking, I own a higher percentage of the high-priced guys as opposed to down below, just because there is less volatility with those higher-priced guys. And also depending on the week. Now, it's funny, there's so many trends in DFS golf over the past 3 or 4 years, and it used to be that the high-priced guys were the popular guys. This past year, what we've seen, and my business partner, Zach, pulls together all of our data and research from winning GPP lineups during the course of the year, and we release that data, and it's showing that a lot of guys are going away from the top price player. And Ben talked about it earlier, producing points for your price, right? You have to finish so high. But if we're getting low ownership on some of the best players in the world, like Justin Thomas was this fall, I'm finding myself owning more top price guys than I ever have before in years prior.
All right, well, that leads us to sort of lineup construction wise. Do you go out of your way to make a stars and scrubs, meaning 2 or 3 high price players, 2 or 3 low price players, or a more balanced approach where in a given week you're taking guys between like 7,200 and 9,000? Do you think that's something that you can adhere to every week, or does it really depend on the tournament, Jeff?
Depends on the tournament, but what we've been seeing this past year is more people are going toward the balanced lineups. And so I've been finding myself becoming more stars and scrubs oriented with the lineups that I'm building. So I'm kind of zigging and zagging with the industry and what people are going with. So yeah, more stars and scrubs lately, that's for sure.
Ben, do you have a preference between the two?
Yeah, I mean, obviously each tournament is a little different. I also have been gravitating a little more to stars and scrubs. The one thing with that, and I've really tried to be conscious of this, and we've talked about it a lot in the Slack channel, is that when you do that, you kind of funnel yourself to specific plays. There's not that many reasonable options in stars and scrubs sometimes. And that's where you fall into duplication traps and other things where you're playing just a bunch of 1v1s with people. So if you are going that route, you kind of want to be conscious and find a way to differentiate. Because step one in any GPP is you need to be unique. If you're not, you're dead. Your EV is shot. So I do stars and scrubs. I have been gravitating towards it, but I make sure to have maybe a guy that's a little off the wall or do it in a unique build where I think I still have that upside.
How concerned are you, Ben, about duplicate lineups in giant tournaments where there's 156 players or 144 players or 132 players in the field that DraftKings players can actually choose from? Because for me, I'm far less concerned about that, and in terms of like pivoting off of a super high ownership guy, because I know I can decrease my ownership level somewhere else on having a sleeper I like, someone I just know is not going to be highly owned, where once we start getting into the invitational fields or no-cut events or WGCs, I think then it becomes a real problem.
Yep, totally agree. Obviously, in non-cut 70-man fields, it's something you really have to be conscious of. I'm still conscious of it on a week-to-week, but it's usually in maybe tournaments that are either higher stakes or less people, where there's more of a reasonable chance that if you play just kind of a straight optimal lineup, it could be duped. But in a big field tournament, as long as you're not going too vanilla, you should be fine. But you do want to be conscious of it.
So, Jeff, how does it change for you in terms of worrying about duplications in lineup as opposed to big field tournaments versus these no-cut smaller tournaments?
I become a little bit more contrarian in the lower entry tournaments, just because I know it's a possibility when you're talking about less of a field, higher ownerships for guys. But the larger fields, I don't really factor it in. I think I'm contrarian enough with my lineup build that it's not something that I really worry about.
Okay, well, let's talk about tournament selection, because I think this is the final piece of the puzzle for a lot of not only new players, but even players like me that play every single week, and sometimes, I just don't know what tournaments in particular that I should be targeting. Where does it fit within my bankroll? How much should I be spending? Is it worth it for me to invest a little bit more money and play in some of these smaller, higher stakes tournament, knowing I don't have to beat as many people? So, Jeff, what do you think? I mean, I know you play stakes at all the different levels. What do you find is not necessarily the softest spot to play in, but really the optimal one for if you're a good player and you play in this size of tournament at this price, you generally will do pretty well?
Well, I think if you're doing multiple lineups, you're better off in the lower dollar multi-entry contests rather than one entry in maybe a higher dollar one. So, having 50 lineups in a $2 contest, I think is better than having one lineup in a $100 contest. If you're building good, strong cores, which I think, our members definitely are, we're giving them the advice that they need to do that. Now, if you decide to bump up in stakes and play a higher dollar amount on one or two teams, what you'll see is ownership clumping big time, because a lot of the bigger players are on the same guys. And it's a lot easier to be contrarian at that level. You'll see guys owned by 50, 60, 70%, whereas those are sharp plays. In the $33, the $3, they might only be owned by 20, 25%. So the competition level's higher, but it's also easier to be contrarian in GPPs in those contests.
Ben, what do you think is sort of the softer spots, and do you think it is worth it to level up a little bit in terms of bankroll if you want to consistently win more?
Yeah, I do think it's reasonable, but for anyone that is going to do that, you want to make sure you're prepared. It goes back to what everyone was talking about before. You have to be prepared to lose that money, because Jeff talked about when you get to higher stakes, the ownership, you can get guys at 75% owned. And a lot of times that's a really juicy fade, but it's very uncomfortable to do. You have to be prepared kind of to make a stand there if you really want to succeed. Personally, what I think is a really good path is hit the 3 max. Single entry and 3 max, you get a chance. You're not competing with people who have a bunch of entries. You can kind of make that core. You can practice that core. Obviously, it's very limited, with only three entries. But you get a chance to multi-enter, and you're not competing against a bunch of different lineups from people. It's a good way to boost the bankroll, and then maybe you can take some shots from there.
Well, how would you go about constructing 3 lineups as opposed to 20 or 150?
Yeah, so obviously you don't have to stands are a little different because your lowest exposure is 33% already. So that's a situation where I will definitely have someone at 100% usually, or I'll do a rotation where I'll just have two out of three on basically all the teams and kind of mix and match. But I really do like 3-max. I think it's nice. You get a chance to kind of really hone in on a core. You don't have to be that wild. You can get really good contrarian plays at low percentages, but you don't have to reach too much. And everyone's kind of on an equal playing field in terms of number of entries.
Jeff, do you have a specific strategy for 3-max entries that differs from what you normally do?
No, it's you're still building the core. Like Ben said, you'd own a couple of the same guy on all three lineups, and then just kind of switch them around. I'm not as high on only three entries because I don't think it's enough to get a solid core. But if you do, I mean, that's fine. Just make it that much tighter, right? Don't make three completely different lineups because it's just not a winning strategy.
How about single entry? Do you play many of those? And if you do, what specific strategy do you think you should go with there?
Yeah, then I think it's just building your best team. Depends on what stakes you're playing at. Like I mentioned, if you play in the higher dollar contest, you get up toward the better players. It's a lot easier to be contrarian. So that's the way I'm going. If I'm playing in a lower dollar single entry, I'm going to go more vanilla. Who are the strongest plays in our model, and just go with that. And and you can still be contrarian, but not as much. You're not making the bold move as you are playing in the higher stakes because you know exactly where the ownership's going to be.
Ben, in terms of single entry, do you lean more towards something that might resemble a cash game lineup that has less risk than in a single entry, just knowing that you're not competing against someone with 150 lineups?
So I don't actually. I think most people do that, and that's why I really like single entry, because ownership is really easy to predict. Everyone goes pretty vanilla because they only have one bullet. What I try to do, I actually go back and I do this every week. We talked about how I do 20 entries. I take one of those teams that I make the 15. I take one of the 2v2 teams. So it's a pretty solid lineup. I think it's pretty vanilla, but at the back end of it, it has a kind of a different feel. It's a little contrarian, has a little upside. You don't have to get crazy though, especially depending on the number of people. You can get someone who's super low owned, who's a very reasonable play just because there's not that many people, and most people have kind of funneled, since they only have one entry, to more generic, pretty safe plays. So I like taking a little against the grain approach in single entry.
Well, one thing that I did a few years ago to get myself more accustomed, like at first I was playing like, hey, I'm playing 20 entries here, and I didn't really understand the concept of playing a lot of entries at one time, something like 20, like I'm trying to build them, but there's no correlation between them. I kind of fell into the trap that both of you guys mentioned. Hey, I'm just owning everyone at this point. I'm like, hey, I'm building 20 entries, I'll throw this guy on here, this guy on here. Now, at FantasyNational.com and at FantasyGolfInsider.com, two good lineup generators that can help you set exposures on players. And one thing that I did, like I said, 2 years ago, is I stopped playing, $8 entry fees, $4 entry fees. I think at the time there were $5 entry fees on DraftKings, and I just worked on my process. How am I going to build my 20 lineups? And frankly, I played in the 25-cent one. It didn't matter if I won or lost on that one. If you win, big deal. You win your like $100, your $500, you move on. That'd be great, mind you. But if you lose $5. It's not the end of the world. And I felt like working through that process at the lower stakes made me a lot more profitable player when I moved up a tier and up a tier and up a tier in terms of stakes. Jeff, would you recommend something like that for someone trying to get accustomed to using lineups?
For sure. Yep, that should be the first place you start when you're building lineups on a lineup generator. Get accustomed to the process, get to know it, and then see what your results are before you start moving up in stakes. No, absolutely. And another thing is, if you are entering, let's say $8 is your price point for your multiple lineups, you might also want to enter those same lineups into the lower stakes ones as well in case that lineup hits. You'll see that happen quite a bit. We actually had a member win $100,000 back when they did the $3 entry because a guy who won the $333 and won 20 grand would have had a better score and won the $3 if he would have ponied up $3 and won $100,000. So be sure to throw in the lower dollar ones if you're building lineups as well.
Ben, what are the biggest mistakes that you see new players make, or even longtime players that you just think bad habits develop, and this is one of them?
I think the first one is just overexposure. Especially when people, everyone's fallen in love with multi-entry, and people just have too many guys, and they don't realize that their exposure against the field is actually just washing them out, and they're paying the rake. Other than that, I think just relying too heavily kind of on maybe course history or current form. I weigh those in, no doubt. But this is, I'm a little more on the feel side. Golf is high variance. Stuff happens. Guys get hot. Things can change, especially year to year. So I'm willing to kind of hold on. If a guy's maybe in somewhat poor form or he hasn't performed well, I'll kind of take the chance and try to buy low. Sometimes I end up holding on too long with a certain player, but once the guy starts playing well, it's a little too late. You kind of have to try to be a week early.
And Jeff, what mistakes do you see a lot of players making?
I think it's just discipline overall, whether it's bankroll management, game selection. I'll talk to people who will give it like 2 or 3 weeks and play GPPs and be discouraged and say, oh, I'm done. I can't win at this. Well, you have to define what your strategy is, what game you're going to play. If it is GPPs, you need to lower your weekly bankroll exposure considerably because, like we talked about earlier, you're not going to win that often. If you're playing 30% of your overall bankroll on a given week, you're not going to be around very long. So I think you need to do that and stay disciplined to it. That doesn't mean, you have one good week, then you push it like you're at a craps table in Vegas or something. Oh, I'm just going to shove, No, you need to scale back. Even if you have 2 good weeks, you stay disciplined and you stay at your weekly bankroll limit. And that way it's going to be a lot harder for you to go bust than it is if you're just pressing all the time.
Yeah, and even that way you can build up some bankroll playing at that level, have a few consistent weeks or a few consistent months, and then you can level up. And hey, instead of playing the $4, I'll play the $4 and then I'll put 10 entries into the $8, 20 entries into the $8 and incrementally do it. I always find that has been the most successful route that I've taken, because what you just mentioned, like the craps pressing it, is the biggest problem that I fall into with football. Like if I have 2 really hot football weeks, listen, sometimes no one is immune to bad discipline. It happens to everyone. And the guys that are the best players in the world at doing this, they have the best discipline in order to do it. And Jeff, I know just talking to you, you can hear it in your voice that you're a guy that practices great discipline. Ben, you too. I myself am more of a crazy person, and this is what gets me into trouble playing football. Like weeks 1 and week 2 this year, I crushed it. Week 3, I basically lost all my money that I had just won. So I think that's a really valid point when it comes to how you should incrementally level up. So don't go from the $8 GPP to the $333 GPP. Maybe try out the $12, maybe try out the $20, maybe try out the $33. Don't just go crazy because you've had 2 good weeks in a row and apparently you think you're unbeatable. Turns out you are not when it comes to that. So practice safe bankroll management is always the way. When I see people succeed, the number one thing that they always tell me is that they are disciplined within their bankroll. They can never go bust in any one week. And that way it gives them more shots, more opportunities. It's the same reason that people play multiple lineups. It just gives you more opportunity to win the overall big prize. And the more shots that you can take at that, the more volume you can play, the better off that you're going to be. Quickly, before we get out of here, we've talked mostly about GPPs and tournaments. Cash games. Ben, I don't really play cash games anymore in terms of PGA. I find that the variance in golf makes it a bit tougher, but do you have a specific cash game strategy that you look at?
Yeah, I'm not a huge cash, at FanVice. Andrew's the cash guy guru. I rely off him a lot, but I have played a lot more just to kind of decrease the variance. Basically, I approach it the same as GPPs, except you don't have to worry about ownership. It's not that. I think one key distinction, a lot of people, when I talk about cash with them, they say, oh, well, that guy's going to be super highly owned. You got to play him in cash. Not necessarily. It's just you don't have to worry about ownership. You don't just automatically play the high-owned guys if you don't like them. So you just take a very safe approach. With golf, I think it's pretty simple. You just worry about the cut. If you're getting 6 of 6 through, you're going to be fine in cash, more than fine. I know that's easier said than done, but you just want safe, reliable guys. Worry about that. The scoring will take care of itself.
I will say, at fantasynational.com, in a beta situation right now, we're testing out a simulator which gives you winning percentage, but it also gives you a make-the-cut percentage. We're hoping that, I mean, nothing's ever going to be perfect when it comes to something like a simulation, because especially in golf, it does not factor in that human element, which is always a really big unknown variable. But it's really interesting to see that there are certain players that just kind of make it through the cut every time. And Jeff, you and I used to talk about this always. I think John Peterson, the first year that we started talking about DraftKings golf, was the guy. He made the cut every week, and he was like $6,300. It didn't matter what he did. So what is your cash game approach?
It's the same. You're going for more consistent guys, high cut percentage, clearly. And, yeah, ownership doesn't matter, because you can look at it from, he's owned by 70%, but if he's a tremendous value at his price, and we have those opportunities all the time last year where guys were really mispriced, and you might be fading them in GPPs, but own them in cash because there is so much value. And if they're owned by 70, that means that 30% of the field isn't going to be achieving as much value as you are in the cash games. So I always recommend to our members that they should be playing both cash and GPP, but also going on the discipline. You don't have to play every week. So if it is a no-cut event, or weather is going to be involved or something like that, where there's more variables, less consistency, don't play cash games. Just take the week off of cash games. Play some GPPs until there's more steady conditions, more predictableness, and play some cash games then.
Yeah, and in places where you feel like you have a better gauge on who's going to do well and who's not. And I think that 70% thing that you mentioned really makes a lot of sense from two ways. So if you have the value guy of the week, the guy who just seems like he screams underpriced, everyone's going to own him in cash games. Let's say 80% own him. If that guy hits, you basically box out 20% of the field who doesn't have this incredible value. But on the reverse side, if that guy misses the cut, well, he's missed the cut on 80% of teams as well.
Oh, absolutely. That's right. So some guys actually target the guys who are going to be heavily owned, even if they don't project out as their best players, just to be on board when they do well. But if they don't do well, you're not crushed at all.
All right, I want to close with some tips and tricks and maybe some ways to mine value that other people don't see. And the one I'm going to throw out first, and Ben, I'll go to you second. European Tour players, when they come over to America, are always criminally underowned and undervalued, and they're never as highly owned as we ever project them to be. So someone like when Ross Fisher comes over, no one's going to own Ross Fisher until he plays like 4 weekends in a row in America, and then people find out who he is. But I just find like first and second week Euro players always present tremendous value if they are good players. So Ben, what do you look for as little ways that you can kind of skirt around, some tricks and tips?
Yeah, I think that's great. Just to piggyback that, as the season wears on, travel. If a guy's flying from a weird place, if it's Australia or something, I'm not saying I just discount it, but it is something to note. One little tidbit, this is more of a secondary thing, but I look for, we talked about how wild putting can be, a type of grass change. So if they're playing, say, bent grass, and then they go to Bermuda the next week, I kind of reset the putting stat. So if a guy's been putting ice cold, I give him a bump up. I think that's a good way for him to shake it. He gets a new surface, especially if it's his preferred surface. And I think that's a buy low spot that I always look for.
That's one thing you can sort by in the custom stats on fantasynational.com. You can select a specific grass type and then sort by that, and you can see who has putted well on Bermuda, on POA, on bent grass over the last 12, 36, 50 rounds, whatever range that you want to make it. Even your own custom date range, but you can specifically filter the stats that way. It's a really nice feature up at fantasynational.com right now. Jeff, what do you see as a few value tips and tricks?
Yeah, I think grass type is definitely good, especially when they go from West Coast golf to Florida golf in about February or March. But one thing to look at, and we talked about tournament history before, is how many times do you see a guy have really good tournament history, but his current form is just awful for months at a time. And then they play really well in that tournament again, and everyone's scratching their head like, oh, yeah, but he's been playing so terrible for 3 months. Something about these guys, they just feel like their eye fits the course. They must feel comfortable in their surroundings. There isn't something that they can define, and that's part of using the tournament history, which I think you have to. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to play well, but oftentimes that's a good opportunity because people will look at their current form and write them off, and their ownership projection will be much lower. And then we're just look at the RSM not too long ago, where Chris Kirk, who's had great tournament history there, he feels comfortable. It's Georgia. He's got Bermuda Greens, and something comes back to him even though he hasn't been playing well. And I think it gives an opportunity for us in GPPs to come up with good spots for lower ownership.
So instead of just blindly trusting course history, be like, this guy has played well at this course, he's going to play well there again, and he'll never not play well at this course. You're saying that using course history might be a really good way to identify a sleeper or two that people just aren't on?
Yeah, especially if their current form is bad, because people will just write them off, and I'm guilty of that as well. Like, I can't picture this guy who's been playing terrible for 2 months can all of a sudden snap back at it. And his ownership is very low, and there he is again, yet another year for the 10th straight year. He's playing well at this course. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's just an opportunity. Just like you talked about when guys are coming over from Europe, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to perform well. Peter Uihlein can't find it on U.S. soil yet, but eventually he will. He's that good of a player. Bernd Wiesberger is another guy who will kill it over in Europe and come over to the U.S. and not always play up to where you think he's going to play. But it's an opportunity for us to take shots in GPPs.
Yeah, even to what you're saying, like one of the RSM, weirdly enough, was probably the most profitable tournament on DraftKings that I had all year long. Weekend Players was really good too. But one of the reasons that I had Ben Crane was because he just had a great history at RSM, and he had been putting well, and just sometimes that's enough. It's really, you can almost build a case for and against almost every single player in the field. It's just, as Ben, you kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, sometimes you just got to play it by feel.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there is something to that. Luke Donald at Harbortown comes to mind, where if it's a track record that's too hard to ignore, clearly there's something unquantifiable about the guy just likes the course. And yeah, we've tried, at FanAdvice to kind of separate. There are certain guys in certain spots that, regardless of current form, are in play. And there's certain golfers who just play well. Johnny Vegas is another guy. When he pops, he pops. Current form really doesn't matter as much. Then there's other guys who are more traditional, and they need to build up to the win, and you kind of see it coming.
All right, I want to close with this, and Ben, I'll ask you this because your podcasting partner, Andrew Barron, kind of brought this to my attention. I just never thought about contrarian and pivoting in this sort of way before. Now, let's say you have two players at $7,200, and one of them is going to be 20% owned, and one is going to be 2% owned. The way that he kind of told me to think about it was, does the 20% guy versus the 2% guy have more than a 10-to-1 chance of beating the other person? And if he does, then you go with the 20% guy. If not, you go with the 2% guy. Do you agree with that sort of mathematical logic?
Yeah, to an extent. Again, I'm a little more on feel, but I will weigh that. It's a good way to look at it. You only have to be right, and that's why it goes right back to bankroll management. If you're taking that kind of approach, most likely the more popular guy is going to finish higher. But you only have to be right once or twice to make up for it 20-fold. And that's where you got to do proper bankroll management and kind of stay the course and make sure if you're making those sound decisions and you truly believe that the guy at 2%, is beating that guy, say, 1 out of 4 times, even though that's only 25%, in the long run, that's the guy you want to target.
All right, Jeff, any final thoughts for the people out there trying to hone their DraftKings PGA games?
No, I don't have anything. I will offer that if anyone has any questions, if they're getting started playing DFS golf, Zach, my business partner, and I are very good about getting back to you. Shoot us an email. Just come to the contact us on our website. We're happy to help you out, give you a guide if you have specific questions. I think the more players in the industry, the better, and the more attraction in the industry, the better for all of us.
And you can find Jeff on Twitter at Fantasy Golfers, and remember to go to fantasygolfinsider.com. That's where you can contact Jeff and Zach and check out all of their content up there. Ben, any final thoughts from you?
No, I mean, I just think that, real quick, I'll just say with Tiger coming back, fantasy golf is going to be building and building. It's a really fun one. Obviously, I do think there's a big edge, but I really enjoy playing it. I think it's a great one to get started. I think a lot of people out there, come and give it a try. And I'll echo what Jeff said. Same at FanVice. Reach out to me. We're happy to get back to you. You can check it out, see some of the tools we have, and I think you'll really enjoy playing. It's a lot of fun, and it's a great sweat over 4 days.
You can follow Ben on Twitter at JazzRazDFS, and of course check out all of his work at fanvice.com. And I'm going to echo that sentiment that Ben just brought up as well. If you like fantasy football, and for whatever reason you just watched all of this and never thought about PGA, it's the most geared like football. You do all your prep for one time, and then you let it go. But the best part about golf is that it lasts 4 days. You get the first day sweat, you get the second day sweat, then you get the cut sweat, then you get the weekend sweat. If you're in it, it is the most bang for your DraftKings dollar that you're going to get entertainment-wise. And realistically speaking, the majority of people who play in DraftKings contests want to win a big one, but they just want to be entertained the entire time. It's for fun for most people, and me especially. This is why I love to do it too. I find it super entertaining. So I think that's the reason to play golf, and it's a lot of fun, like Ben mentioned, and you get those 4 full days rather than a 3-hour baseball game with 7 games going on at once. Now, this is bang for your buck. It has longevity, so I recommend that everyone go give DraftKings Golf a try this year. You will definitely enjoy it. I'm Pat Mayo. You can follow me at ThePME on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram if you ever have any questions. You can also check out all of my work up on DKPlaybook.com. I'll have written articles, DraftKings cheat sheets, and you can find all the shows embedded in those articles along with links to every sort of stat that you're going to need this week. And I recommend that everyone go to FantasyNational.com and just check out the simulator, the lineup generator, the rolling stats. It is so customizable. It is a one-stop shop. If you are interested in making your own picks and not listening to anyone else, FantasyNational.com is where you need to be. You can subscribe to the Pat Mayo Experience video version up on the DraftKings YouTube page and the DK Live app, and for the audio versions, uncut, uncensored, almost every single day, you can get that on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or Audio Boom. I'm Pat Mayo. Enjoy playing DraftKings Golf. I'll see you next time.